What is up, everybody, and welcome back to TarHeelIllustrated.com. I'm THI staff writer Jacob Turner. Joining me, as he always does, very own publisher Andrew Jones. And AJ, we're here for another episode, the Week 3 edition of This Week in the ACC. Going to be talking about the matchups this weekend. 13 games, only one conference game between two conference opponents, with that being Florida State at Boston College. But still a very interesting weekend for the league. Got 6 games against Big Ten opponents, 1 game against a Big 12 opponent, and 1 matchup against an SEC opponent. So still, when you're playing these non-conference games against some of these bigger P5 programs, it means it's important for the league as a whole, and you want the ACC to be doing well. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on in this show. But let's start, AJ, real quickly with mentioning our sponsor on this podcast, and that is Underdog Fantasy. Big thank you to them for sponsoring this show. We will talk about them a little bit later on in this one, so make sure you guys stay tuned for that. But we're going to divide these as we always do, AJ. So I'm going to start with the first 7 matchups, and then we'll talk about the final 6 in the second half of this show. So I'll pop a graphic on right now and run through those. Starts on Thursday evening with Bethune-Cookman at 22nd ranked Miami, and then a Friday night matchup, Virginia at Maryland. I think that's a pretty interesting one. That one being College Park. Then you got number 3 ranked Florida State at Boston College to start the Saturday slate. That's a noon kickoff. Louisville at Indiana starts at noon as well. That'll be played in Lucas Oil Stadium, home of the Indianapolis Colts. So that'll be a pretty cool neutral site matchup between those two teams. Wake Forest at Old Dominion. That is the last noon ACC matchup of the day on Saturday. And the final 2, at least in the first half slate that we're going to be talking about, VMI at NC State. Should be a pretty typical and easy win for the Wolfpack. That's 2 p.m. And then Minnesota, of course, at North Carolina, 20th ranked Tar Heels, 3:30 p.m. kickoff. Did a football show on that, so we're not going to talk about that matchup. But AJ, when you look at, I guess we'll just say these 6. I ran through 7, but excluding Minnesota and North Carolina, I think there's a few matchups in here that stand out. There are no matchups this weekend with ranked team versus ranked team, but there are still, like I mentioned, some big time matchups against some bigger conference teams. So which of these matchups kind of, I guess, stands out to you the most? Because I guess going through that slate, it would probably be, I don't know, Louisville and Indiana, maybe Virginia at Maryland. I know Virginia's down this year, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, Maryland's not bad. Maryland should win that game comfortably. They used to close the season against each other back when Maryland was in the ACC. At least close for a long time, because a lot of times Virginia Tech would play in the middle of the season.
Yeah.
For a long, like in the 80s and 90s and stuff. So Maryland used to play a lot at the end of the year. There's a natural built-in sort of DC area rivalry because the Metro DC area is kind of split, Maryland and Virginia. And people say, well, ACC lost the DC market. No, they got Virginia Tech. And trust me, half the students of both schools come from DC area. So
sure, yeah.
That'll be a cool game for that area to have. But unfortunately, Virginia is just not very good right now. They're going to struggle in that game. Miami will get nothing out of playing Bethune-Cookman. I do not think that FCS games should occur. It does you no good to play those games, just like State will get nothing out of. Well, State actually might get something out of playing VMI because they got to get the offense rolling.
Yeah, they do.
So the offense at least has to find a groove and build some confidence. Otherwise, no reason to play that game. FSU, BC, and BC barely beat Holy Cross. They lost to Northern Illinois. Seminoles are going to go in there and roll. No problem with that. The Louisville, Indiana game, I think, is really interesting because it's in Indianapolis, and it will be a split crowd. Yeah, Louisville's not that far from Indianapolis, and a lot of the media up there, cover one another. The Louisville paper, I believe, they cover the Colts and the Pacers.
I'm sure they do, yeah.
And they cover IU because I've seen columnists, one of the great columnists at the Louisville Courier-Journal. I've seen him in IU when I've been there covering basketball games before. So. I think that'll be a really good game for the league as a barometer. And that's what this weekend's about to me. There's 8 non-conference games. There's 8 games against Power 5 teams. So the ACC has built up a little bit of currency through the first 2 weeks by getting some high-profile wins, 4-1 against the SEC. But they need to back it up this weekend. That narrative could change quickly, especially with what 6 of these 8 games are on the road.
Yep.
So you got to figure Virginia's going to lose at Maryland. So, and if you want to break even in these games, where are the 4 wins going to come from? I know that you haven't listed all the games here, but are the ones that you did note here, I think Louisville beating Indiana in Indianapolis, it's probably a 50-50 game, although I do like what Louisville's done so far.
Mm-hmm.
And probably, I don't know if they're favored or not. I don't look at lines. They probably should be favored a little bit in that game. So I think Louisville ought to win that game. That would be good for the league, because it would be not good for the league if they lost. Indiana is not going to carry cachet even when they're good. It would take them 10 years of being good to carry cachet. They just don't have that. Wait, going to Old Dominion is dumb. I just don't think the ACC should play games like this. For some reason, the league does too much of this stuff. It needs to stop. It needs to play these games at home. Don't go risk anything going on the road. And like I said, via my NC State, NC State shouldn't be playing an FCS. No one should. But I do think if there's a team that gets an FCS team right now, like I said a minute ago, I think NC State needs this. They need to get that offense going. They need to find out where their skill guys are, because the Wolfpack, I would argue, has been the most disappointing team in the league so far based on offense.
Yeah.
We thought there would be a little bit more what the Wolfpack has done offensively. So this is a good opportunity for them to maybe strike a little spark and get going some.
Yeah, no, completely agree with that. Before we move into the second half slate, which I think there's some interesting matchups in here, particularly a rivalry matchup between two teams, I want to give a shout out to Underdog Fantasy. You mentioned them earlier on, and we are extremely excited to be partnering with Underdog Fantasy. And the reason we decided to partner, one of the main reasons, is because of the biggest and fastest growing fantasy app right now in the industry. And that's just awesome to hear, because there's so many fantasy apps out there. They're the fastest growing out there right now, and they've got a lot to offer, and one of them is their pick'em game. And in this game, you pick your favorite players and whether they'll have a higher or lower stat total in this week's game for a chance to win big. It's so easy to play. All you have to do is pick 2 to 5 stats of your favorite players, choose whether they'll go higher or low, and you can actually 20x your money by just going 5 for 5, which would be absolutely amazing. They also have a Best Ball Mania. If you think you know football, you got to check this one out. This year's Best Ball Mania has $15 million in total prizes up for grabs. $15 million, AJ. Winner taking home $3 million. That's a big chunk of change right there. Wouldn't mind that. So sign up today with promo code HEAL. That's promo code HEEL to get your first deposit doubled up to $100. Check them out at underdogfantasy.com. You can also find them in the App Store as well. And don't forget to register with the promo code HEAL to get your first deposit doubled up to $100. Must be 18 plus and present in a state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms do apply. If you're concerned with your play, call 1-800-522-4700 or visit ncpgambling.org. Links in the description for all you need to know about Underdog Fantasy. And again, just make sure you use that promo code HEAL when you sign up. Big thank you to them for sponsoring this show. Now, AJ, let's move into the second half slate of the ACC matchups this weekend. 6 more games to go through. Starts with Northwestern at 21st ranked Duke. Seems like that's a matchup we see every single season, especially early on between those two programs. 3:30 p.m. kickoff in Wallace Wade. Virginia Tech at Rutgers. Virginia Tech looking to get back on track following a loss to Purdue at home last weekend. That game kicks off at 3:30. Georgia Tech at Ole Miss, 17th ranked Ole Miss. I think it's going to be a very, very tough evening for Georgia Tech to go down there and get a win. 7:30 p.m. kickoff. Syracuse at Purdue. Mentioned them earlier. Purdue coming off a win in Plattsburgh. Now Syracuse will be visiting West Lafayette, Indiana, to take them on at 7:30 p.m. Now, AJ, I'm going to go ahead and mention Florida Atlantic at Clemson, 8 p.m. matchup. Don't think anybody really cares about that one. Pittsburgh at West Virginia, 7:30 p.m. kickoff, backyard brawl in Morgantown. Carolina's next opponent after Minnesota this weekend is who? You guessed it. It's the Pittsburgh Panthers. That, for me, is a matchup I'm keeping an eye on. That's a rivalry game going into West Virginia, an emotional one for them. Could be maybe a positive omen for the Tar Heels going up there next weekend with the Panthers coming off a big rivalry game, and one that'll definitely be a little bit chippy and a little bit physical between those two teams. So, AJ, a little bit more games, I think, in this second half slate that stand out, right?
Yeah. And the networks that the ACC is on Saturday is pretty wild. They have 2 games on ABC, Florida State BC's ABC, and then the West Virginia Pitt game's ABC.
Yep.
They're on NBC. The Syracuse Purdue game's primetime on NBC.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to flip around at 7:30, flip over to the SEC network, you got Georgia Tech at Ole Miss.
Yep.
and you've got Carolina on ESPN. You've got back-to-back ACC teams on the Big Ten Network main channel with Louisville versus Indiana and Virginia Tech and Rutgers. So the ACC, it's a big weekend for the league.
It is.
Because a lot of eyeballs are going to be on this league, and these are mostly road games. So if the league can, if Syracuse could go into Purdue and get a win, and Pitt goes into West Virginia and gets a win, and Carolina and Duke take care of business, and Louisville gets a win against Indiana, that's going to look good for the league. Mm-hmm. It's going to help the league a lot. So I think so this is such an important weekend and such a huge opportunity for the league. But individually, those games, Duke should handle Northwestern. I think Duke's legitimately good. And
yeah, I think Northwestern's
got all kinds of
got a lot
of stuff going on. Yeah. But that's important that Duke doesn't let Northwestern hang around. They got to take care of business and put them out. Mm-hmm. Put them out and move forward. Virginia Tech at Rutgers, it's probably an even matchup. Virginia Tech's just not very good. Rutgers probably is favored in that game. Rutgers should probably win. Virginia Tech's not going to get much currency winning that game, but it'll be a black mark if they lose that game because even though Rutgers has had a couple of decent teams in the last 15 years, you don't get a whole lot out of beating Rutgers. Georgia Tech and Ole Miss is interesting because we want to find out where Brent Key has that program. Mm-hmm. And a year ago, I think the worst moment in time in the Jeff Collins era was when Ole Miss went to Grant Field, Bobby Dodd Stadium, and I think it was 42-0. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Yellow Jackets didn't show up; they weren't ready to play, and they got throttled. So, where are these guys now going to Ole Miss? And this probably might be a better Ole Miss team. So, I think it's a good barometer game for Georgia Tech, which is another one of Carolina's opponents later on this year. A lot of people believe Brent Key's the right guy for that job. A lot of people believe that he has fixed a lot of the corny stuff that was going on under Jeff Collins. So he's kind of cleaned up a lot of it wasn't that Collins had a bad program going with guys getting in trouble. Collins was just a very gimmicky guy. And Brent Key is not. Yeah, I use the term dot your I, cross your T all the time, but he's that kind of guy. And that's what you need at Georgia Tech. And that's what you need to go on the road and compete. So it'll be interesting to see how much they can compete in Oxford in that game. Syracuse, Purdue, that was one of the best games of the regular season last year in the Carrier Dome. Huge win for Syracuse. They opened up, I believe, 6-0. Very big game for the league. Purdue won at Virginia Tech last week, and you don't want Purdue 2-0 against the ACC.
No, you don't. So
go in there and get that win. And then Pitt at West Virginia. You know, a lot of us thought Pitt might be the third team in the ACC, but they were getting pounded early at home by Cincinnati and ended up losing. If the Panthers lose this one, they're 1-2 with a 2-game losing streak with Carolina coming in.
Yeah.
And you really wanted Pitt to win these games if you're a Carolina fan because you want to win at Pitt to mean more. Mm-hmm. You want it to register. So this is a huge game for Narduzzi and this team. It's a huge game for Jerkovic, the quarterback there. They got to get some offense going. The defense has to play a little bit better than it has at times, so they need to be more physical. So that's going to be a barometer game for them, and it's a huge game for West Virginia because they lost to Pitt last year. And it's the first time Pitt's rolled in there for the backyard brawl in a decade at least. So, and Florida Atlantic, Clemson, I do think it's an important game in that Clemson needs to come out and strike early.
Yeah.
They trailed Charleston Southern. They were only up, 17-14 at the half or something like that.
Yeah, they were
and then
bad.
They exploded in the second half. I mean, Clemson's got a lot of question marks hovering over. Florida Atlantic's shouldn't challenge them, but they are an FBS team at least. Charleston Southern was not. But I think if you're a Clemson fan, you want to see that offense erupt early and be surgical because that could be a sign of sort of like NC State against VMI. You need to see that. You need to know it's there. You need to know it's possible, and they need to have that feeling. And they need to go into a film room and say, see, guys, if all that of you do what you're supposed to do, we're going to move the ball and we're going to have some success. So they need to see that right out of the gate. NC State needs to see it, period.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, of course. No, you're 100% right. You mentioned odds on a couple of games. I think,
by the way, I'm going to predict 5-3 in those 8 games. I'm going to predict 5-3. And I think 5-3 will serve the league very well.
Yeah, agreed. Especially with some of these games really, being on national television Like you mentioned a couple odds. I'll read those out too. You mentioned the Louisville odd. Louisville currently a 10-point favorite over Indiana going into that one.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. 10-point favorite. Yep. And then you mentioned, what was the other one you mentioned? Was a Syracuse at excuse me, it was a Virginia Tech at Rutgers. Rutgers currently a 7-point favorite going into that game. Again, that's in New Jersey. So AJ, last question I want to ask.
That might be 7-0.
It might be. It very well might be when you look at how those two teams, particularly Virginia Tech's been on offense in particular.
QB play, man. I'm surprised that Louisville is favored by that much.
I was a little bit surprised too. I don't know a ton about Indiana this year. Typically,
but Jeff Brom does, because Jeff Brom was the coach he was a coach at Purdue, and those two are fierce rivals. So
yeah,
he'll have a better handle on IU than IU will have on them.
That's a good point. That is a really good point. And just to tie it back to North Carolina real quick, because I mentioned this when I talked about the Pittsburgh and West Virginia rivalry, backyard brawl, that one being in Morgantown. Do you think that might be a positive for North Carolina with Pittsburgh having to play that game again? They've struggled a little bit early as well, having to come off that game and get up again for North Carolina at home, or do you not really buy into those kind of narratives?
I think that there are times when that matters. You can look at it one of two ways. If Pitt loses, Warren Narduzzi is going to have them ready to go against Carolina, coming off 2 losses, right? Yeah. But if they lose, there's a reason they lose. There's a reason they lose at home to Cincinnati and lose to a mediocre West Virginia team. Maybe they're just not that good. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it matters that much. I think in basketball sometimes it matters more. Like if you play a team, if you play at Clemson, the game after Clemson hosts Duke and they beat Duke, you know that they're going to be flat for you.
100%.
History shows that, like in the ACC, when teams beat North Carolina or Duke, they always, like 85% of the time, I'm throwing a number out there, but a lot of the time they lose their next game.
Yeah.
Football is different because you can be as ready to go as possible. And if you just can't handle the trenches, you can't handle the trenches. It's not going to matter. So I'm not going to put anything into that. I would watch Pittsburgh to see what the Panthers are all about. I think given what happened the other night, Narduzzi learned a lot about his team, and whatever adjustments need to be made, they'll be made because he's a good coach. Mm-hmm. And that is a thorough program. But is it enough to win in Morgantown? That's going to be a zoo. Those people are going to have all day to get frothed up. And that place is going to be a zoo. So it's a great test for Pitt. If you're a Carolina fan, you want Pitt to win and you want them to look good because you want the Pitt game to mean more.
Exactly. And
you want to win up there to count for more.
Exactly.
So that's one reason we're doing these this year is because Carolina fans are like, oh, I don't care what those guys do. You guys are foolish to think that. You should want all of your opponents to win their games. Mm-hmm. By the way, who South Carolina plays at Georgia this weekend.
Yes.
And who does App play? App plays ECU at home.
App plays ECU at home. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the Georgia-South Carolina game, that could be a small barometer to gauge Carolina's performance against South Carolina. If the Gamecocks go in there and they're very competitive with Georgia, that might help Carolina with because this sport is about perception.
Perception,
right? Yeah. If App State struggles with ECU, who got pummeled 2 weeks ago, maybe that doesn't help a lot. Maybe App pounds ECU, and that kind of makes App stand out and pop a little bit more. I mean, college football is about comparing scores. It's about comparing what was the score at halftime, what was it at the third quarter, what was the final. To help us understand, because there are not enough games to get a full gauge. So we have to do that. In basketball, we got a lot more games to get a gauge. In football, we don't have that many, so we must compare scores. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this ACC pod every week this season. We haven't done them in the past.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is incredibly important. And ECU, you mentioned ECU 0-2 coming off a loss to Marshall as well. So if they go up there and again, maybe beat App or App struggles with them, that could be a little bit maybe of a negative on how much Carolina played. But again, that is also a different game too, because I've always talked about App State and being it's kind of like a rivalry game for App, because there's a little bit of hatred in there, a little bit of animosity in there because it's a state school and a bigger state school, but it's not really like that for Carolina. Like that, Carolina doesn't consider App State a rival. So I think it's always a dangerous position for North Carolina because you're going into a game against App State, who it's kind of like their Super Bowl, quote unquote, and Carolina just doesn't view it like that. You talk about rivals of North Carolina. It's not App, it's Duke, it's NC State. Those are the rivals. So I do think that game is always a bit tricky for the Tar Heels. It's a fun matchup to watch because it always, for some reason, ends up being an instant classic. But I think that plays a little bit of a factor in it too. But you do want App State to handle ECU, especially with how ECU's looked so far early in this one, because I don't think it's a great football team necessarily. So that's the slate for this week. Some good matchups in there. Again, only one conference matchup between Florida State and Boston College. That one in Chestnut Hill. You expect Florida State to roll over BC, as that's a program right now that is struggling, to say the least. So, AJ, fascinating weekend again for ACC sports, and we'll see what happens this weekend with these matchups. I've been Jacob Turner. He's been Andrew Jones. Another episode of This Week in the ACC, Week 3 edition of this series. Hope you guys are enjoying. If you are, go ahead and hit that like button below. Make sure you share it with your friends. Subscribe to, hit the notification bell as well, so you know every single time that we upload. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.
Thanks.